Rob, are you good?
Yep, we're up.
I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Finance Committee for June 3rd here at 6 p.m. in Town Hall. The committee is going to consider the following: amendment to Article 121 and amending the general fund adjustments. Can the city clerk please take roll?
Mr. Reynolds,
Present.
Mr. Cologne,
Present.
Dr. Van Wert.
Present.
Thank you. So we will start then with, I guess, a presentation or comments from the administration on their proposed amendment to Article 121.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I will follow up on my memo. This memo was submitted on February 21st. It's something that the budget director and I have talked about for some time. We want to bring to council, have a discussion with you to what we are proposing, eliminate an additional step that's currently required as part of 121.05. And I think the best way to maybe explain how it could help is if I quickly walk through the process of a purchase, whether it's be a construction project, a contract, a purchase. So I put together a sample of a fire truck as an example, and we'll go through it and explain how it comes into play, 121, and why we believe it may be more efficient and timely both to the vendors that we work with, whether it be a small business or other contractor, and it's certainly more efficient internally among several different departments, including the clerk's office, including Mark Sivak's time, as well as our accounts payable office. Mr. Yasso, our controller, also, I'll mention at this time, I won't speak for him. I will tell you he is in support of this as another individually, separately, branch of government, elected official and separate branch. He also believes that this would be best for all involved, and he will not be here tonight, but he'll be here for the next council meeting. So if this passes tonight, moves on to full council, he could offer his comments as well. So for my sample, we're going to assume for 2020, that last fall during the budget hearing, the administration proposed to borrow $1 million for a fire truck. That through the budget hearings, council approved that proposal, and that $1 million was added to borrow $1 million in a bond to purchase a fire truck. We move into the spring. The next thing in the process is Chief Aki, or his designated representative, would pick out a fire truck or company to work with and begin the bidding process, whether it be through CoStars or on Depend Bid. And once the process takes place, we'll assume he came up and has a truck picked out to be built for $950,000. At that time, he would submit a requisition into our purchasing department. Our purchasing department would look at the budget, make sure that there is in the budget book approved by city council a fire truck listed for $950,000 or less, and that would be the case. It would also then go to that separately branch of government, elected leader, the controller, and would need approval from the controller before it could even be converted into a purchase order. The purchase order is what the vendor, the builder of the fire truck, would require before he even started building the truck. So it wouldn't even get that far before the controller was involved. The vendor would then work to complete the fire truck that we ordered. And when the truck was done, they would mail an invoice to the city of Bethlehem to be paid. The city would receive the invoice in the accounts payable, run it as part of the check run. Our accounts payable department would send the check as well as the invoice together back to the controller for approval to, once again, for the second look by the controller to make sure that that is a correct amount and that amount has been approved by council. After that approval is in place is when the checks are mailed out. That's the process that takes place. By adding in 121, the segment that was added in here, and this was added in 2011, it requires additional step is that when the process I just talked about, when the invoice gets mailed after it's been built and the PO and the controller looked at it, now it's built and the invoice arrives, 121 requires us to send that invoice and Terry to collect and accounts payable to collect all the invoices from that particular week, to send it to Mark Sivak every single Friday. And he's been doing this for 9 years now. For 9 years, Mark's been collecting all the invoices, some a couple, sometimes a pile, depending on what's going on, the activity of that week. They're all scanned. So this is when the time gets built in, this additional order, these redundancies, I would say. Puts them all in, stands in front of the time, getting them all scanned in, sends them, puts up the email, sends the email to the city clerk's office. Then the city clerk's office puts in the file, sends it out to all council members to look at all the invoices that came in. And then after that, it needs to wait a week for the council to respond if they have issues with any invoices. And then at the end of that additional week, if there's no response, then Robert says it's okay to pay him. And then we continue. Then Mark gets that email and then goes back to Terry in accounts payable to do the check run. So it adds significant time from 3 different city personnel on top of all the checks that have been put in place to that time. We sometimes, through that extra delay of 7 to 10 days or longer, we have the vendor waiting. Sometimes we lose out on discounts when you have sometimes get an extra discount if you pay within a certain amount of time. And that extra time certainly limits our ability to do that. And that's why we felt, given those steps, we talked to the controller about it as well, with his thoughts, and he was in agreement with us. I'll let him speak about it at a later time. But that's what brought this to us to bring to you tonight.
Thank you. I'll start by turning to my colleagues on the committee. If Mr. Cologne or Dr. Van Wert would like to make any comments. Mr. Cologne?
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Just a couple quick comments and a quick question. I also had a chance to talk to Mr. Yasso earlier today, and he had echoed kind of Mr. Evans' statements about him being in support of this. And I mean, in my 5 years now, I guess, or 5th year on council, I know it's always been pretty routine for the invoices to come through, the emails, thinking about, I never really gave it any thought of how much it could delay the operations at City Hall every day. And I'm sure Mr. Sivak looks forward to all that every Friday, across desk and everything like that. But one question I do have, Mr. Evans, because you were on council at the time, or if you could just speak to 2011, fairly recent, 9 years, not too long ago. What was sort of the genesis of this coming before council at the time and this being passed back in 2011?
In 2011, Mr. Reynolds was a veteran of the council at that time as well. I believe in Chairman Reynolds, if you also want to correct for the as I'm kind of bringing this back, it was Councilman DiGiacinto. Am I correct with that? If that sparked this, the build out of this particular addition to 121.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. In going back to 2000, Mr. Sivak, 10. In 2010, there were issues with bond accounts. The cash account ran low enough. It was teetering above and below. We've talked about this recently. The number 0. And that fall, I'm trying to think of the timeline of it, it was leading up into around budget time. The question was, or the request was, to propose money to borrow for a bond like we do every year. Normally we borrow during the fall budget season, or we propose during the fall budget season. It's approved in December, and sometime after that, the administration works with PFM to then go and get that bond. That usually takes a matter of weeks or months. At that time, interest rates were low. The administration borrowed the money earlier. Was it before or after Christmas or New Year's when that borrowing?
Before.
It was before. So council approved it outside of the normal budget.
Correct.
The capital bar. Okay. Normally, when we do the budget, we talk about the operating budget and capital budget at the same time. We stamp it all at the same time. And then the 2020 operating budget goes into play as well as the capital. Back in that year, in 2010, we approved the capital budget in the fall before we approved the operating budget. At that time, the administration went out, took out the bond, and used that money that was in the bond account for other bills that were coming due at the time. Bills like medical, I think was the biggest one, and
Payroll.
You want to speak for administration? I have to put you on a turn to
The
you
two
for that.
biggest items, as Mr. Evans said, was payroll and medical expenses, so that the employees' medical insurance wasn't cut off.
So that's when that came to light, when that came out, because shortly after there, it came to light council's attention. And then again, Mr. Reynolds and I were both on council at that time. There were a number of things added into it that would not be able to happen again. Now, and I can talk to Mr. Sivak and articulate this better than I can. This particular amendment or this change would have not made a difference in whether that happened or could happen again or not based on what's in here. When we talk about the process, having this in here at that time would not have changed what happened at that time in 2010.
Understood. I do appreciate the historical background of where this came from in 2011, and I would be supporting this tonight at committee, and then when it moves forward to full council, if it does move forward to full council. So thank you, Mr. Evans, for the brief history lesson, and those are all my questions, Mr. Reynolds.
Thank you. Dr. Van Wert, did you have any comments?
Yes, I did. So thank you, Mr. Colon. That was the question I was going to ask too. What is the historical context in which this was enacted? I do, however, have some concerns. Of course, my concerns are not in relation to the current administration in place. I'm always thinking farther down the line, if we do get into economic trouble and the administration goes and puts another bond out there. I understand that this may have not made a difference in 2011. However, I think this oversight was put into place for a reason. And when it comes to council oversight, I have deep concerns about giving away any council oversight over the process. I do understand and I feel for the vendors. I do feel that if they want to deal with a solid bill-paying entity like the city, they should extend their discounts to us. Everything is variable. So my concerns really are that we could get in the same situation again and lose that ability to have that oversight. Additionally, well, I have great faith in Mr. Yasso as the comptroller. A comptroller is really more of an if person. Is this legal? Is this allowed? Whereas council is more of a why person. Why is this happening? And those are two entirely different votes. So I don't want to assume necessarily that this is not something I would be comfortable with, but I actually would ask you, can you refute any of my concerns and make me feel better about this at all?
What I would say, the whole section 121.12 was added back then, and we are keeping certain sections such as it has to be in a separate account, and even Part B was not in there before, where it says we have to notify council before we would use the funds for any other purpose. Like I said, Mr. DiGiacento's purpose of putting this in there was so that we would not borrow the funds for things like payroll or medical temporarily and transfer them back. And that's always been my argument that piece of it that we're trying to get out by sending council the invoices, wouldn't eliminate that, because if we borrow $5 million, in theory, we're not doing it, but we could borrow $2 or $3 million and pay it back, and council seeing these invoices. Council would never realize that. I think the other big item that's happening now that wasn't back then also is because they are separate bank accounts. I know Linny is sending council monthly the bank statements, and you would see on there if money was being transferred, because it is a separate bank account now, from there to, say, the general fund or some other fund for another.
And I do wish my scrutiny of those were as diligent as it could be. I actually find the singular emails more informative of what we're paying our bills for. It's just, for a part-time city council member, that's a lot of digging to maintain oversight. I am more comfortable with the idea of maintaining oversight in the current situation. And so while I understand the expediencies that are necessary, I don't feel that they outweigh the imperative of council oversight here. So I will not be supporting this tonight.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. One is I had a conversation with Mr. Yasso as well, and he kind of walked me through that same type of that same process that Mr. Evans did. And I believe as well, and maybe Mr. Sivak can inform me about this, but I believe that the process now is different than the process previously as far as the controller's involvement in these particular in when these checks get issued. And I don't know if that started with Mr. Yasso or when that started, but as it was explained to me, that process by which he sees it twice and he checks and everything or whatever in the controller's office is different than it used to be. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think it did start under Mr. DiGiacinto, but prior to that, the controller's office only saw certain invoices over a certain threshold. I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but I believe it was when Mr. DiGiacinto was elected, and with the financial issues that were going on at the time, he decided he wanted to see, every requisition before it was converted to a purchase order. And then same as when checks were cut for invoices, he wanted his office to review them all before they would be mailed out. So yes, that's correct. That process has changed.
And am I also correct to say that the only thing that is being, and I'm reading here, it says no expenditures and or transfers of these funds shall be made from separate accounts without prior written notice to city council. So the only thing that generally happens is that those emails or memos get sent to President Waldron. If he doesn't, or the President Council, if they don't, if there is no reason for him to necessarily look at this and say, I want to double check this, then nothing happens, correct?
Yeah. Again, I'm trying to go back in time. I had to, refresh my memory to when this was instituted. It was even as this 121 went in, it was, okay, what is the process for city council? All the steps we kind of talked about. What do they need to see when? What is deemed approval? Does there need to be a vote every week on this when we talked about prior written notice? And where we ended up with as a council was that it'll go out on a Friday. If after a week there are no flags, no one calls or questions, then it's deemed approved, and then we will go ahead and pay. So it's that 1 week wait until we get the answer back that, okay, council's okay with it. And if there was no answer to it all, it's all silent on it, then it's kind of deemed approved. But that's what's been going on
all of these expenditures are previously approved in the budget, correct?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It wouldn't even get through purchasing. So for something to go, for a requisition to come into purchasing, it would even stop right there. And again, that's part of the administration, so it's not a different branch of government. But when we even get that far, when the requisition comes in and our purchasing department says, where does this go? There needs to be an account number tied to it. And then once they tie it, and it's okay, it's from the bond account. And so when it starts moving down that path, that's when the purchasing department looks at it for the first time. And then the controller gets involved very early, even before the PO is issued. Because another thing, and as you march through this process where it gets awkward, is let's go back to the fire truck example. It's proposed in the budget. The council says it's okay for a fire truck. So we order the fire truck. Controller says, yep, it's okay to do it. Purchasing gives them the PO. The vendor builds it and then sends us an invoice based on that PO. And now if council would vote no, what do you do? What do you tell the vendor? He said, wait a minute, you issued a PO. Well, we issued the PO because it's in the budget. Now they built it. That invoicer really can't say no to it because they built it, because the process was followed. It was in the budget, and we would be sued in the end because they built it. Either they built us a construction project, they did Rogers Street for us, they did a contract, they did whatever example it is that we're talking. These are all capital purchases. By the time the invoice comes, the work's been completed, right? These are invoices. It means the work has been done. It's been complete. And now what would we do if council voted no to paying the invoice, to go backwards and say, oh, never mind on that truck that you built for us? So that's another issue that also comes up as this process is in place now.
Thank you. I also wanted to comment that I believe in the past we have had audit findings about the timeliness by which we have expended some of our funds. I believe that's correct. I think that and I forget if this is CDBG or this is capital or this is liquid fuels, but I believe that there's often a time frame by which we're supposed to pay, and if we don't, that and I forget what the exact term is. It's one of those findings that comes up. Is that correct, Mr. Sivak?
That's correct. Yes, in the single audit, it's generally with some of the highway funding dollars we receive, where they have the state has a time requirement, but because some of these are older contracts, like some of the projects that lagged on were like Lynn Avenue Bridge or ones like that, where they mail us a check. So by the time the check is mailed, gets to us, and we issue payment, there's just a time delay there.
Yeah. I guess I would say then that when you look at this and you see that in 121, the only thing that's really changing is that kind of process by which the administration sends council this prior written notice, this memo, which I don't believe, and I might be wrong, but I think in the 9 years that it's been in place, I've never seen it acted on. And I don't think I ever acted on it in my 4 years as president, and I don't believe it's been acted on. And I understand the reason to change it. With that being said, I think what we're keeping there, as far as the funds being deposited in a separate account, and also money can't be spent that we didn't budget without prior written notice to city council. It is a situation by which I feel more comfortable than I might have 9 years ago after speaking with Mr. Yasso and looking at the process by which checks are created. And I do think, and I understand Dr. Van Wert's comments there about the particular person in the controller's office, but I don't believe that that's a process that will now change as far as how checks are necessarily gone out, the fact that they come back through. And I had a long conversation with Mr. Yasto about this, and he has certainly not been hesitant in the past to tell me when he had to tell Mr. Evans or Mr. Sivak no, or said, no, you got to go to council for this. And I do believe that not just him personally, but as an institution, if he thought that this wasn't a good idea, he would have felt free to tell me. But yeah, considering that all that is going on here is that we are not getting that email about the expenditure, I do feel as if this is a change that makes common sense when you take a look at both the timing issues, the potential for the audit findings, and what else that is remaining here in 121. Councilman Smith has joined us here. I'm not sure if you had any comments on the change to 121. Okay.
She's
I
muted.
think you're muted. Okay. Well, I take that she's okay with that. Are there any further comments from any members of the Finance Committee before we pass this on to City Council as a whole? Hearing none, if the clerk could please call the roll on moving this amendment on to City Council as a whole.
Mr. Cologne,
Aye.
Dr. Van Wert,
Nay.
Mr. Reynolds,
Aye. Passes 2-1. The second agenda item we have for tonight here is amending the general fund adjustments. Mr. Evans, you're going to take that one, or Mr. Alcohol?
I'll take that. This is to request a line item in Public Works budget to hire or enter into a contract with an outside consultant to build a GIS base for our urban forestry assets. Over the past 10 years plus, we've attempted to do that using in-house resources, but unfortunately, It's very time-consuming work, and the former city forester, for the most part, could not devote sufficient time to get anywhere with this project. Most of the time, utilized the sum and earn turn to try to build the database. What this is about is creating a GIS layer that would take inventory of all our urban forestry assets, essentially all the street trees. There's probably somewhere near 15,000 trees. It would initially build the database, build key data about the trees, the locations, their types, their age. And then eventually it would also build the database with the history of the trees, when it was might have been removed, when it was planted, that sort of thing. And it will greatly assist in the permitting process and essentially all urban forestry functions. It'll make the process a lot more efficient, a lot more timely to retrieve data, to evaluate data. One example would be, we're doing a tree beautification project, or hoping to do soon, for Northside 2027. That database would be, essentially, if it was ready, it would be utilized for that, and that sort of thing. So this is, since we haven't been able to do it in-house for quite some time. I think we've built maybe 20% of the database in all that time. Again, because of lack of resources, there was only the city forester that could be devoted to this, and she had plenty of other functions to do, so she couldn't devote a whole lot of time to this effort. And in fact, this coming season, we're not even hiring an intern for the summer. First, we did try to see if we can find some grant funding to assist to pay for this. Unfortunately, we were not able to, but then we subsequently identified the tree escrow account as a source of revenue to do this work. The estimated cost for a consultant to build this database over a couple of months time frame is $45,000, and that's what we're asking for line item to be set up. This way, we'll get this work done, and we can start utilizing it and benefiting from much greater efficiency and accuracy in managing the urban forestry assets.
Thank you. I'll turn to members of the committee for any comments. Mr. Colon?
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Alcohol, just real quick, couple of quick questions. This escrow account, which you refer to as the tree escrow account, can you speak to a little bit, where is the $45,000 coming from exactly?
The escrow account is an account that money is placed in, that is paid by developers for tree-related. For example, if a developer is proposing to develop an area and they couldn't plant this or that tree, or there's fees involved that they have to pay, and they would go into this escrow account to be utilized for tree-related work in the future. I think there's currently, Alicia's here, I think there's over 300,000 currently in that account. And I think there's 70,000 or so pending to be deposited into it that haven't been deposited yet. But that's what that account is, and that's where we're seeking to get the revenue for this contract.
All right, thank you, Mr. Alcohol. And then related to the 45,000 estimated cost for the contract, have any other local I guess, where does that estimate come from? Have other local municipalities conducted any kind of projects like this?
That estimate, we requested proposals from at least four firms, and the lowest qualified firm came in at that number, 44 something.
Understood. And I will support this tonight. I think it's a good idea. I know there was, I don't know the status of it, but a similar kind of inventory in relation to our street signs a number of years ago citywide. And I always think it's good to have, to know what we have, and when you have the abilities to add GIS layer like that, I think it's a good idea. Have any other local municipalities engaged in a project like this, to your knowledge?
Quite honestly, I have not checked, but this is common practice. I mean, we've done it for many of our assets. We've done it, like you mentioned, for the street signs, and it's mainly for the purpose of improving efficiency, for permitting, for executing projects. And then at the end of the day, it really save you time and money and increases accuracy. But we did it for the street lighting. Obviously, all our infrastructure is in GIS layers, our water distribution system, our sewer collection system. And this is just a next step. And as I said, we've been trying to build this database for the past 10 years. Unfortunately, we just haven't had the resources to do it in a timely manner. And this will help us finally get that achieved.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Alcohol, for the feedback. Those are all my questions, Mr. Reynolds.
Thank you. Dr. Van Wert, did you have any comments?
Yep. So this sounds like a very good idea. Can you describe to me, will it be like a map that you can see the different types of trees, or is it more of a kind of a Word document of where trees are? And
It'll be
how old
both.
they are?
It'll be data that's collected that would be, it'll be essentially a map. It'll be in an electronic format. Of course, you can print it out, and it'll have data. You can click on a tree and a screen would pop up with key data about that tree. They may be attached to that a permit issue. There could be a code enforcement letter attached. So it'll be essentially one-stop shopping for the city forester or whoever to evaluate, to check the history of a tree and what's been happening to it, to check the status, see if there's outstanding issues with it, if there's enforcement issues, if there's been fines, everything will be in this.
so is there an aspect of this that the public could have access to?
I'm sure there is. It just depends on what's appropriate to.
I don't mean enforcement issues. I mean more, I think there's a lot of people who were upset about understandable need to take down trees on the Greenway last fall. And I would see that this could be a good way to help keep our citizens informed of big changes that are happening in important places like along the Monocacy or the Lehigh or along in our public parks and streets. If we could give them information, then I think ahead of time, they would understand why certain things are being done. It's just something to work on in the future, I think.
It's
The more we can put out there,
it's
the better.
absolutely feasible to disseminate and have access for as much information as we deem appropriate.
Okay, thank you very
Helpful.
much. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Van Wert. Let me just, before I forget, I just want to echo Dr. Van Wert's comments, and that's one of the ones I was going to make is 100%, I think, at some point. I understand how there needs to be priorities here in the short term as far as how to do this, but I think creating one of those citywide type of maps, and obviously you're not going to put, we don't need to put this tree is owned by this person or that, but I think if we could put where it's, even just general things like private, institutional, governmental, things like that. It is, over the years, we've had some questions. And, Dr. Van Wert mentioned a bunch. And I remember a couple years ago when those trees were cut down by PennDOT on 378, right abutting the west side there in the first couple avenues. And there was a lot of conversation about that, about where those came from. So, it might be a small thing. Obviously, it's not, it doesn't need to be the first priority here. But I think as much as we could do that going forward, I think it has the potential to be the type of thing that people really appreciate. I've also heard about this tree inventory for years. And, Mr. Alcohol, you might remember when it first came up. But, this has been a conversation, I want to say, for 6, 7, 8 years. It's one of those things that, people talk about, where'd this tree go in my neighborhood, or this person had a tree up there and then they cut it down and the city never came and did anything about it. And it's one of those things that people end up, chasing all this information that may not exist. And currently the way we do this is, it's inefficient. And, I think it's, it's not the way that anybody would want to keep track of anything that's important. And obviously the trees are important. I think one thing going forward that, I've learned in this that I was not aware of was the fact that, there was almost $300,000 here in this tree escrow account. And I don't know if this is a question for Mr. Sivak or Mr. Alcohol, but, do we have an estimate of how much of that money we spend every year? Is that $300,000 been adding up over, a number of years, or is that, do we put $50,000, $75,000 into this fund every year? Just, I guess, some more information on the particulars of that fund.
I don't have all the details, but it's definitely been adding up over a number of years, and it kind of depends, on the development
activity.
that's going on at the time and whether they can, plant the trees required or not, and the fees that are out there. I can get council more information, but that balance is probably built up, I'd say, over the last at least 8 or 9 years.
Yeah, so you think
And
we
there's
haven't
not
spent any
much
money in
that's-
here?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You don't think we've spent any money in here for 8 or 9 years?
No, we have, but not as much as that's been going into it. I know they've spent some money to plant trees in the capital account, but maybe to the tune of, some years maybe only 20,000 a year of, tree work or tree plantings, and some years 50 or 60,000 might have gone into it.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be, tomorrow or the day after, but if maybe in the next week or so, we might be able to get just some numbers there on how much we've spent from this fund over the past, say 6 or 7 years, how much has gone into it. Just, some short descriptions of projects. If we did plant trees on the Greenway or whatever it might be, I would be curious about that, just because, like I said, until this particular item came up, I had not heard previously about this particular fund, and I'm just not very, very knowledgeable about the amount of money going in, or even what kind of triggers that the requirement that Mr. Alcall referenced before.
Okay, we will definitely get that for council.
Thank you. Is there any other comment from any member of the committee or Councilman Cramsey-Smith about this? Yes.
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions. One about the escrow account. I was wondering what specifically can those funds be used for besides tree planting?
I mean, I would think, what's that? Anything related to trees that would benefit trees is what this, this account is dedicated for. And certainly, tree removal, tree planting, and associated work that benefits trees. And this is an example of something that obviously would be benefit our urban forestry.
Okay, all right. And while I understand, I agree totally, getting this database system sounds like a really good thing. I'm wondering, you said there won't be an intern this year. Is that just because of the way things are happening? Because I just think it's always good to have, use interns and give, not only are we getting some, quality labor from interns, but they're getting valuable experience. And I'm thinking as this goes on, if the database needs to be updated, maybe we can, seek out the use of interns or even like different college classes. I don't know whether it needs to be computer-based or environmental science-based or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, every year we seek out interns. Sometimes we're successful even getting unpaid intern, although that doesn't happen very frequently. And the decision for the intern was just for this year in light of what's been happening, in combination with the fact that we have a new city forester who isn't quite, he's getting acclimated to all the functions, and it's not the worst time to skip a year in terms of the intern until he has everything under control and knows exactly how best to utilize that intern. Especially in light of the fact that that intern will not be utilized for this anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from any member of council?
Yes. Yes.
Dr. Van Wert?
Thanks. Ms. Cramsey-Smith's good question actually just brought up something in my mind. I run along the Greenway probably 4 times a week, the entire length, and I stop and talk to your guys when they're doing tree work. And I stopped one day and they were working on a huge tree with 5 separate trunks that came out of it. And I said, hey, what are you guys doing? And they said, oh, we're just chopping off this little tiny dead branch. And I came back the next day and there were 3 trunks left out of the 5. And they were still there. And I said, hey, what happened? You said you were just going to cut down a little. He's like, well, we're not arborists. And he said, the city doesn't have an arborist. We would love to be an arborist because we don't know what we're doing. But but there is nobody who is trained as an arborist. I said, well, how much does an arborist cost? And he's like, well, we just have to have the training. You could have one of us go and do the training to be an arborist, to be able to do this type of more surgical tree work. So I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I would like to plant this in your brain that maybe this would be a good use of those funds as well, to certify one of your guys who's really into trees or our forester as an arborist themselves, so that they know what they're doing when they go out and fix these, really valuable trees.
Yeah, we have in the past had some of our crews certified for tree trimming. In particular, I believe some in grounds, but mostly what I know for a fact, because I took over ground only a year or two ago, in streets, because we do tree trimming to have clearance for our street sweepers, for our paving activities. And oftentimes we can't afford to contract that out. And we obviously don't want to butcher the trees either. So we have had a few guys go for that and get that. And it ebbs and goes. Sometimes we have nobody other than we have an arborist. Obviously, the city forester and maintains a license. The only thing I would say in that instance, that's definitely a good idea. We're always look to do that throughout the city of people that we would use for that type of work. But even now, all the work, and there's been a transition, so maybe that's part of the confusion.
Mhm.
But the city forester is strictly directed, as well as all crews, that any tree trimming work be done under his direction and previously under her direction. So I don't know why these guys would tell you that they have no directions, but it's either somebody dropped the ball if that was the case,
Okay.
or they just didn't do what they were supposed to do, and that's the way to get out
You
of
made
it.
it sound like there was no city arborist. So I'm glad to know that our forester is a
always had
certified arborist.
The
and
requirement of the position.
hopefully that will have some oversight in some of these larger works especially in our parks. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you. I would then ask the clerk to please call the roll on moving the general fund adjustments onto council as a whole.
Mr. Cologne,
Aye.
Dr. Van Wert,
Aye.
Mr. Reynolds,
Aye. Passes 3-0. Is there anything else from the administration today?
No, that's all we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would open it up for a public comment on anything before the finance committee. I would check with the city clerk. I can't see
we have no one signed up.
okay, no one signed up. And if you are listening, this would be the time to call in. Mr. Verdoni, does it appear as if anybody's trying to call in?
We do not have anyone calling in on the comment line.
Okay, then seeing and hearing none, this committee meeting is adjourned and council will reconvene in 15 minutes for our general council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.